Today, I'm going to help you fix your hair. Well, sort of. That's coming up. Hello, everyone. My name's Daniel Reeks. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're going to be talking about hair. And I get it. I don't look like I have a lot of experience with it. Believe it or not, I used to have some back in the day. It's been like 20 years, but that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about how to develop hair in your leather projects. Now, whether we're talking about a horse or a person or a silly little grumpy gnome like what we've been working on in the past couple of videos, it's really important that you get the texture and the depth correct in the hair. Otherwise, it's not going to turn out right. And there's a few things that you need to factor in as you're going along and developing that depth and texture. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing you have to realize is that you can't develop that depth and texture in a single pass. It takes multiple passes and it develops slowly over time. To do that, we're going to start with a stylus and we're slowly going to scribe in the flow lines of how we want the hair to lay. This does a couple of things for us. One, it helps us visualize what the end result will look like. And two, it helps us see and correct any issues that might pop up really early in the process. Once the flow lines are in with the stylus, we can jump over to our modeling spoon and start developing the general shape of the hair. But how do we do that? Do we go in and do we add in the individual hairs? We could use a hair blade to do that. Well, if you do that, you're going to end up with a very straw-like look to the hair. So that's not what we're going for. If you look at the picture here of this woman with this beautiful hair, one of the things I would point out to you is that you don't see the individual hairs. Yes, you can see it around the edges where she's got the rim light, but for the majority, what you see are the locks of hair and how they lay on top of each other. So the question is, how do we develop that look? Well, you could go in with your stylus and start drawing in locks of hair. But that's one, that's not going to get you the look that you want. And two, it's really not the best approach. It's certainly not the easiest approach. What I would suggest to you is instead of drawing locks of hair, you think of it as drawing shadows. And we're going to jump over to the picture here real quick, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. As we look at this, there's a couple of things that I want you to notice. First of all, the shadows in hair, a lot of times they have a sharp side and a faded side, and they can go back and forth. The other thing that I would point out is a lot of times one end of them is triangle shaped. And if we can keep those two things in mind, developing the hair and working in the shadows is much, much easier. Let's go over here and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if we look right down through here, what you're going to notice, and back that out so you can see it. What you're going to notice is that there's a pretty crisp edge on one side right in here, and then it starts to fade out a little bit. Move that again so you can see what I'm talking about. So a really crisp edge through here, and it fades right through here. You've got a really crisp edge here and here. So that's one example of how you can get a really crisp edge. And we would use the modeling spoon, the leading edge of the modeling spoon, to develop that crisp edge to the shadow. So let's back those out. So when we talked about how it can fade out, here's a good example. So right in here, you've got another crisp edge. But if you look right down through here, you'll notice that it's not sharp on that side, it just fades out. And the way we're going to develop that is by using the curved side of the modeling spoon. So the leading edge of it gives us that crisp edge. The curve creates that fade. So now let's back that out and I'll show you the other thing I was talking about. You remember I said that there's two things we need to keep in mind when we're developing hair. Number one is that typically you have a crisp edge and a faded edge to the shadow. And the other is that the shadows tend to have one end that's kind of triangle shaped. And you've got a lot of examples of it right here. So we come in here, you can see there's one triangle right there. There's another one there. You got another one there. Let's see what else we can find. Here. A little bit of one here, it flattens off, but you can see there's one there. But one thing I'll point out is they don't all point up. And here's a good example. You've got a triangle right here, kind of here. There's another one here. There's a triangle that points up. Just a few examples there, you can start to see how there's a lot of triangle-shaped shadows within her hair. So if we keep those two things in mind, developing the shadows are going to be a lot easier. So as we're working in the shadows, we want to make sure that we're doing it somewhat lightly at this stage of the game. Remember, we talked about how you develop hair texture over time. So what we're doing is we're using that leading edge to really define one side of the shadow. The curved side is giving us that fade out into nothing on the other side. And we're going very lightly, just enough to work in the basic shadows for now so that we've got time to correct it if we make a mistake. So once we got the basic shadows worked in with our modeling spoon, now we can go back in and start developing some very basic texture. And the way we're going to do that is with a hair blade. If you're not familiar with a hair blade, essentially this end of it right here has parallel lines on the end of it, and you drag it across the leather. It's fantastic for developing the texture in a feather and for developing texture in hair, like a horse hair or human hair or something like that. The problem is these straight lines kind of act like a rudder. They want to continue going in a straight line. Well, we got a solution for that. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to take the hair blade out of the handle it comes with and put it in our swivel knife. Now, it happens to be the same diameter as a basic swivel knife blade, so we can remove the hair blade from the handle that it came in. Allen wrench takes, loosens the set screw, and then we can drop it into our swivel knife, and that allows us to override that instinct that it has to run in parallel lines, because now we can work it back and forth and create those flow lines that mimic natural hair a lot closer. So as we work the texture into the hair, there's a couple of things I would want you to notice. Number one is that I'm being very intentional. That's why I'm going so slow, really taking my time. There's no reason to hurry. And number two is that I'm following the flow lines that we've already laid down. That's what they're there for. So once we've got the texture worked in, it's time to make another pass with the spoon. Now, why would we use the hair blade if we're just going to use the spoon? Isn't it just going to erase some of the texture? And the answer is yes. We want that to happen. We want the hair texture to fade in and out. That would naturally happen with shadows and highlights. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more a little later in the video. So as you're doing this, make sure you're tapering all your lines. It's really rare that you would want one of the shadows just to come to an abrupt stop. Creating shadows is all about knowing when to fade, when to taper, and when to create that sharp line. The further we get into developing the hair texture, the more I'm going to restrict my work to the shadows. I'm trying to create deeper and deeper shadows as we go. And the way I'm going to do that is by pushing the leather in deeper and creating more burnish. But as the further we get into this, we want to be more and more particular about which shadows we enhance because those are the shadows that are going to draw your eye. So we're getting down to some of the final details now. And with that, we want to make sure that we're reserving the darkest areas for the darkest shadows. If you were painting this, then you would reserve true black and true white for the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights. And the same is true here. What we want to do is, as we're working this in, we're going to reserve the darkest shadows, the darkest areas for the deepest parts of the hair. So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to be using a pear shader, but it's not a pear shader that you may have seen before. Most of the pear shaders that you're going to see, especially in floral, are going to have a very rounded bottom to them, and they're kind of egg-shaped, right? Well, this particular pear shader is very elongated. It has straight lines on it. It has a very pointed end and a rounded end on it. And what this is going to do is allow us to get up in those triangle areas and really fade it from one area to another and really enhance those darkest, deepest shadows within the hair. So as we work the shadows in with the pear shader, there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind. Number one is that we're working in the very darkest shadows with the pear shader, which means we want to use this technique sparingly. These are going to draw the eye more than any other shadow in the hair texture. The other thing that we want to keep in mind is that the shadows almost never come to a dead stop. Even that tip of the triangle is going to fade into other shadows. The third thing you need to keep in mind is that triangles point up, down, and occasionally sideways. So don't get caught in the trap of just having them point up or point down. Really, you want the variation in there so that we really develop that texture that we're looking for. So before I show you the next step, I want to jump back to the tablet for just a second. It'll be a little easier to show you some of the details that I really want you to focus on as you're doing this. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. The first thing that I want to point out to you is the orientation of the pear shader. A lot of times you might be tempted to go in and have that pear shader oriented like this. So you're going to run it parallel all the way down like we might with a traditional bevel. But with this particular pear shader, it has parallel lines on it. So we're creating texture, hair texture, as we're adding in the shadow. So what you want to do is you want to keep that pear shader oriented almost vertical. You can come off vertical just a little bit if you want to, but it needs to be more or less vertical as you're going through and adding in these shadows. So here's the second thing that we need to take a look at. Let me get rid of these red lines. As I go through, my pear shader is oriented vertically like that. So I'm gonna come across and then I'm gonna drop into a shadow. I'm gonna come across and drop into a shadow. So that's very important to blend the horizontal shadows with those vertical shadows that we have. That's one of the other reasons that it's really important to make sure that pear shader is oriented vertically because it's going to be really hard to make that transition if you've got it oriented horizontally. So as we're doing this, you may be thinking, wow, those details are so small, they really don't even matter. Those small details are what separate the good from the great. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that I'm one of the greatest, but I am saying that this is one of the things that's very important to me with my work. Those small details that most people will never notice, but you will, and you know how much of a difference it makes to your work. So I found a great example of what I'm talking about on one of those details that really makes a big difference. So let's jump back over to the tablet for just a second. If you look right here, I'm going to draw over the top of it, but if you look right there, there's a highlight that shouldn't be there. And essentially what's happened is there's no texture that's been added to that area. But if you look at it, obviously it doesn't look like it's part of the rest of the hair. So we need to go in and we need to add some texture to that. And that might be a detail that most people would miss, but I guarantee their eye won't miss it. So something like that is definitely worth going in and making sure that you correct that and get it worked into the rest of the project so that it fits and it flows naturally. Now it's just a matter of continuing to develop those shadows until I get the look that I want. So you remember I talked about how we were going to talk more about removing texture adds more depth. Well, there's two things that remove texture and detail from any artwork, whether it's a photograph or a painting. Those two things are shadow and shine. So let's jump back over to the picture of the woman with really long hair, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So if I zoom in right here, let me bring it up a little bit. You can see, I'm going to pull out a little bit. There you go. You can see right through here, this dark area, it is so dark that there's no detail in there. I can go up and we can look at this area right here, and there's virtually no detail in that either. And that's because the shadow and shine has removed all of the detail from those areas. And that's something that we want to replicate in our work because, again, that's a subtle detail that your eye will pick up, even though the person might not. And it really accentuates that depth that we're going for. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to go in with our modeling spoon and we're going to mute the texture in the areas that we believe that there would be a bright shine. Now, one thing I'll caution you, this is just like those deep, dark shadows. We want to use this sparingly. Think of it like the true black and the true white. You want to use that in 1 to 2% of your artwork, and the same is true here with the dark shadows and the brightest highlights. So now that we got that done, let's go ahead and finish this thing up. So if you're finding this video helpful, do me a favor and click the like button. That tells me, tells YouTube, tells Weaver that we're on the right track and that we're making videos that you like, and it helps it share to other people. In the next video, we're going to paint this guy. But that's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. And in the meantime, go make something amazing.